Thank you. Goedemorgen allemaal. Ik ben Jimmy Nelson. Zoals je hebt net gehoord, eigenlijk ben ik Engels. Ik woon al 15 jaar in Amsterdam. Maar vanochtend ga ik in Engels spreken, omdat het verhaal dat ik wil vertellen is heel persoonlijk. En het gaat veel meer over mijn ziel en wat ik voel dan per se qua over fotografie. Zoals je me de geduld zal kunnen geven, ik ga nu overgaan naar Engels. Firstly, get some pictures on. A brief introduction to begin with. Walking around in this fair is fantastic. It's very advanced, very exciting. It's very technical. But to be honest, what I'm going to talk about this morning is something very far removed therefrom. You're all photographers, I presume, much the same as I am. But the project I've been busy with for the last few years goes far beyond photography, or maybe that's exaggerating. It's not. Photography is the disguise for the real story that's based around it. It's far more about feelings, it's far more about emotion, and far more about a journey. And in actual fact, a very, very personal journey that's disguised with a passion for photography. I'm going to start with some images. This was made in a place called Chuvsgol. Chuvsgol is in northern Mongolia, a very, very isolated part of the world. And this is in February. It's taken me about 3.5 weeks to get here. I'm on my own, and I'm trying to photograph a group of people called the Satan. But everything's going wrong. I'm cold to begin with. It's about minus 40 degrees centigrade. I'm lost. I'm lonely. I'm isolated. I'm missing my family. And most importantly, it's nigh on impossible to communicate with the Satan who I'm trying to photograph. I don't have a translator with me, and I'm trying to photograph them in a way that goes beyond traditional reportage photography, a way whereby I direct them. And the only way one is ever going to photograph them in a directed way is find a way of communicating, but I'm failing. So essentially, I've almost given up. Every evening where we would travel over the mountains, they were on a sort of a nomadic journey, we would all sleep in this teepee on top of a mountain. And you'll be with about 30 of them, all in the teepee. At night, the temperatures went even below minus 40 degrees centigrade. You would all sleep together. It was very sort of cozy. But again, very, very lonely, because I couldn't make any contact with them. And I wasn't making the pictures. And I thought, what on earth have I done traveling all this way to the other side of the world? And then on this one particular night, when essentially I'd given up, and I was on the verge of crying, they offered me a drink. And it was a sort of homebrew version of vodka. Very, very strong. And I'm not a big drinker. And doesn't really suit me very well. But on this particular night, I thought, well, I've given up. I have nothing to lose. So I started to drink. And within a very short period of time, it was fantastic, because I was warm for the first time in weeks. So I took another drink, and I took another drink. And before I knew it, I was completely and utterly drunk. But it was absolute heaven. Everything was floating around me. I was warm. I could feel myself. It was fantastic. And subsequently, I fell into an alcoholic coma. I fell deep onto the floor of the tent, in amongst 30 of these adults, children, dogs and cats, in this teepee, fast asleep and extremely happy. Middle of the night, I woke up and I had a technical problem. As one often knows when one drinks, you often need a loo, the pee in the middle of the night. And I woke up and I was lying there, my head was spinning, but still very, very happy. Full bladder, and then I looked around me and I could see and hear all these snoring people. I thought, well, I've got a problem. I sat up and I started to swear and said, oh, Jesus, if I stand up now, I'm going to fall on them and wake them all up, and I don't want to do that. So I thought, as often is the case when one is drunk, I'm going to be very smart. So I'm going to quietly roll to the side of the tent over the bodies. I don't have to go outside. I'll lift up the side of the teepee, and I'll have a pee outside. Everything will be okay. So slowly I went on my journey. Started rolling over these bodies to the side of the tent. Then I made my first mistake. I took off my gloves. Then I lifted up the side of the tent, and then I went for my flies. But as is often the case in the cold, you're wearing a lot of clothing. And in my particular case, I had about 9 or 10 different layers on. So I first started going for the Velcro, and then I started going for the buttons, and then for the zip. And then obviously being very drunk, and then subsequently my fingers freezing, it got more and more complicated the further the layers that I went. Until eventually, as one often knows the case, psychologically when you're preparing to go to the loo, you're already going before you're actually there. So I'm 10 minutes into this journey trying to find my journey and failing abysmally. And I peed. And I peed everywhere. I peed all over myself, and I subsequently peed all over the tent. But most importantly, and I was very happy with it, nobody had woken up. Everybody was fast asleep. The wind was still blowing, and I thought, well, it's okay, job done. In a few minutes, I'm going to be frozen anyway, so everything should be okay. So I rolled back into my place and fell fast asleep. Until 2 or 3 minutes later, the tent started shaking and the whole thing collapsed. 40 reindeer had stampeded over the tent and they'd collapsed it. So we all woke up. It's nighttime. It's minus 40 degrees centigrade. Everybody's screaming. Most of them were drunk, including some of the children. And everybody's stumbling around this mountain in this blizzard. There's a small fire. And there are all these reindeer stamping over the tent. And then all of a sudden, the reindeer, like you, start coming towards me. And this is a very strange experience. If you're drunk, cold, isolated, in the middle of the night, and 40 reindeer start coming towards you, it's like a surreal dream. And the closer they came, they started to lick me from head to toe. Oh no, I can't handle this. It's so far removed. And I'm walking backwards up this hill, screaming to these people, help, 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 until all of a sudden I saw all these Satan, who up until a few minutes ago were very angry. They all started laughing and started pointing and bending over, and they were sort of waving and waving and waving. And they said, oh, and then 2 of them came through, pushed the reindeer away, grabbed me and said, why? And they said, essentially, why did you pee in your pants? And I said, well, I didn't pee in my pants. And they said, well, you did, that's why the reindeer are licking you. I said, what do you mean the reindeer are licking me? And they said, well, they love urine. They love urine because in the urine there's salt. And because for 11 months of the year in our landscape there's only ice and snow, there's no salt for the reindeer. So in actual fact, we pee all day in these little leather bottles. And that's what we use when we travel with the reindeer over the mountains to keep the reindeer with us. We throw the urine on the floor, and then they follow us. So next time, you need to carry one of these little leather bags. And I said, well, why didn't you tell me that at the beginning? And they said, well, you didn't tell us you'd pee your pants in the middle of the night. But what subsequently happened, and from that day on, everybody spent the whole day laughing and pointing at me and offering me even more vodka, which I actually took, was that we found a sort of a way of communicating with one another, a way that went far beyond language, far beyond body language, something about, I illustrated that I was human, or more importantly, that I was fallible. I was capable of making very, very classic human mistakes. And subsequently, we managed to forge a relationship of contact, and a relationship that eventually enabled me to slowly start making these pictures I'd planned on making. So by failing, by putting myself on the line, by sort of falling over the edge, a contact was forged. So it was a very, very, very important lesson. This was about 4 years ago. But I'm going to take you further back in time and explain why I'm standing on a mountain in February in Mongolia, peeing my pants, photographing the Satan. This is me when I was about 7 years old. My father worked for Shell. He traveled around the world as a geologist, and I've been traveling with him as a child. Then at the age of 7, very classic English, they said, Jimmy, it's time you go to boarding school. We can't look after you. So off I went to a Jesuit boarding school in northern England. They bought me my bag, my tennis racket, my ticket, and my passport. And I subsequently became almost zelfstandig at a very, very early age, traveling back and forwards around the world to wherever my father was working. I got to the age of about 16, and I was traveling back from yet another location. I think it was Sierra Leone in West Africa, and I was very, very ill. I had cerebral malaria of the brain, and I was quite poorly, and classic parents, although I'm sure they loved me, but they didn't quite know what to do with it. They said, well, this school will look after you. Off you go. So I got on this plane, arrived back in this school, stumbling around, very ill. I was actually probably quite sad and stressed because I would like to have been looked after by my parents. And the house arts of the school, sort of Harry Potter establishment with lots of gay priests, he turned around, he gave me a pot. He said, well, if you take these, you'll be fine. And so I glugged down this pot of medicine, and I woke up the next morning looking like this. I suffered from, it's called alopecia totalis. I essentially lost all my hair in 24 hours. At the age of 46, it seems somewhat irrelevant because most of us end up going somewhere in that way. But when you're 16, it's a very, very profound experience. You wake up one morning looking like somebody else. You don't change as a person, but everybody interacts with you in a very different way. And it started taking me on a journey of who am I, where do I fit? Because of my appearance, what do I represent? What do I stand for? It's also very, very English. We were very busy in the mid-1980s, well, traditionally for years in appearance and class and status, and I had changed overnight. So I decided, to cut a very long story short, when I got to the age of 18, there's only one person who's going to solve this, and it's going to be me. So having spent most of my life traveling, I decided to buy a one-way ticket to the one place in the world where other people walk around bald, but they're respected for the way they look. And that was Tibet. And this was in 1986, and it was 1 year after Tibet had opened for tourism, having been shut for the last 30 years thanks to the Chinese. So I bought a one-way ticket. I didn't tell anybody where I was going. I didn't tell anybody why I was going. To be honest, I don't know why I was going, other than to get lost and find myself. And I went on a journey, and I walked from far western Tibet across to the east over a period of a year. And I took a small camera with me, a Zenit B, and 4 rolls of Kodacolor gold. And I knew nothing about photography, and on the back of the rolls you have a picture of a moon, a picture of stars, pictures of rain, and a picture of the sun. And that gave me the rough idea of the aperture. So for 1 year I had 4 rolls of film, and those are the images that I made. I got to the end, came back to the UK, showed a few people the photographs, and they were published. Not necessarily through the quality of the photography, but more about the story of me going on the journey. But it did give me an idea. It did make me think, well, this is perhaps what I want to do. Not necessarily become a photographer, but be free to travel and to go on adventures, have experience, and make contact with people. Something which, from the age of 16, became a real issue for me. So slowly I evolved into the profession of photography. I worked for a number of years as a reportage photographer in my early 20s. And then in my mid-20s, met my Dutch wife, who said, one day you're going to have to learn to play the gas en licht. So I slowly evolved into commercial photography, worked in there for about 15 years, until about 4 or 5 years ago, I came essentially to a midlife, I think crisis is very dramatic, but a midlife self-reflection. And the world of photography was changing, everything was had become digital. There were many more photographers, and I was losing my enthusiasm for photography. I was never really a commercial photographer. My heart and my soul, my passion had always been in this subject. Until my wife turned around to me and said, you only have one choice, Jimmy. You've got to go back to what you've been doing since your childhood. You've got to go back to what your hobby is, your passion. That is the world's last untouched ethnic indigenous cultures around the world. I said, yeah, but that's all fine and well. I'm not an artist. I've got 4 kids. I've got a mortgage to pay. You're threatening me every month with other alternatives which are not very attractive. You're not telling me to disappear off into the bush and make pictures of tribes people. And she said, well, yes, I am, because that's who you are. That's what you feel. That's what your passion is, and that's what you know about. And it's extremely important. So 4 years ago, I decided to take the leap. I stopped all my commercial photography ventures. I've been using, as a hobby, a traditional 4x5 plate film camera. I came up with 35 different tribes or groups which I've been researching for many years, and I chose them from their isolation, their aesthetic appearance. I'm not an anthropologist. It's purely their aesthetic and their diversity in the planet, and also the diversity of the nature with which they live. And I wanted to make an artistic document. As I said, it wasn't anthropological. It's purely a celebration in a very, very classic, very old-fashioned way of the world's last, most beautiful, in my opinion, culturally relatively untouched peoples. Very much in the same vein as Edward Sheriff Curtis, the American photographer who died in about the 1950s, who made that fantastic document of the world, the Native Americans. When he had made it, it was not appreciated, but only many years after his death. And it was probably the most fantastic aesthetic culture on the planet. It's a culture that doesn't exist anymore. So in essence, I've tried to copy him, but on an international scale. And I came up with these groups. So I set off on my journey. It was all about their aesthetic, all about their pride, all about people who, again, I didn't discover anything. I'm not an explorer. I'm not per se an adventurer. I am a searcher, probably very much on my own personal journey. And all these people had not necessarily themselves been photographed, but the cultures have been filmed and photographed before. But I tried to put them in a light that was very aesthetic, very iconic, a celebratory light, a light which they are not normally presented in. we present ourselves in the West in a beautiful way. We're always attracted to beauty. We're attracted to beautiful people, beautiful things, beautiful places. And often they're not necessarily objects or people that deserve that attention. I believe that these cultures and these tribes are extremely important to us. They're extremely important for what they stand for, who they are, and what they look like. And we have to preserve them in some way, in a documentary way, to learn from them, and then for them also to eventually learn from us. So as I said, I started out on this journey. It was purely self-indulgent, purely what I wanted to see, what I wanted to do, with no greater context. And then on that journey, taking this old camera with me and ending up in extremely intimate situations, much the same as the story I began with accidentally peeing my pants, and getting very, very close to these people. And I came across a lot more profound experiences. And I think perhaps it had to do with age, self-reflection, that it went far beyond photography. But the camera and the old tripod took me on a journey, took me closer to people that I wouldn't normally have got to. And throughout the process, many, many things happened, but I want to share three aspects, three stories with you, stories which affected me, and take the project far beyond just pretty pictures of tribes around the world. And the first one is, this is a fantastic landscape in northern Kenya, near Lake Turkana. It's probably some of the last, purest, most beautiful part of Africa that still exists, and these people live there. When I first came back from the trip, I'd been there for a month, I showed this picture to my kids, and they said, "Oh, Dad, they're beautiful, those ladies. What are they doing standing there with spears?" And I said, "But kids, they're not ladies." They said, "Of course they are. Look at them. They're wearing skirts, they've got long hair, they're standing, they've got thin waists, and they're obviously very vain." I said, "Well, they're not ladies at all, they're guys." And he said, "Oh, they can't be guys. Look at them, they're as queer as anything." I said, No. In actual fact, they're the opposite. They're the antithesis of what a male human being should be. They're warriors. They're the Samburu warriors, and they're some of the most extraordinary men on the planet. Look at them aesthetically. Obviously, they're very beautiful, they're very vain. They spend half the day combing their hair, playing with these little mirrors, covering new beads. They end up stroking each other, pulling the gnats out of each other's hair. Very vain, very effeminate, very delicate, almost like sort of ballerinas walking around. But behind that exterior, behind that aesthetic vanity, is something extraordinarily profound. After a number of weeks traveling with them, we noticed on all the camels they had these fantastic scars all over them, and we sort of said, what are all these scars about? And then the Samburu turned around, "Oh, they're the lions." And they carried on talking. And I said, "Well, come back again. What do you mean they're the lions?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, they often get attacked by the lions." Very matter of fact. And I said, "What do you mean attacked by the lions?" "Oh, yeah, when we're asleep at night and we've got the fire going, the lions come in and go for the camels." I said, "Yeah, but the camels are still here. So who fights the lions?" "Oh, we do." I said, "What?" I said, "Oh, yeah, we have to protect the camels because they're our commodity. So we go after the lions, and it's quite often we can catch them." I said, "What? You, with all your hair and all your beads and all your mirrors and your thin waist, can literally catch a lion?" And they said, "Yes, we can." And then they turned around and carried on as a matter of fact. Although I didn't see it happen, I came back to Amsterdam, I started doing research. I said, I don't believe these people are physically capable of doing that. And they were, and it's a known fact that the Samburu are capable, with two of them, without any form of weapon, in attacking and killing a lion. Now, through photography, through an indulgence in looking at these people, looking to find these people, putting them in this fantastic environment, making them icons, making it a very, very aesthetic image, I wanted to show it and share it that beyond the photograph, there's a message that's far more than what you see. And I think it's a lesson to us in this environment. We're very busy with judgment. We lead a very comfortable life. We lead a very easy life, or more often than not, far too easy life, in my opinion. It's very difficult to feel and see. But one thing we should do, we should always look beyond what we're initially presented with, because more often than not, it's very, very, very different than it initially presents itself to us. So going back to my own story, obviously my own journey, being obviously desperate to communicate that I was somebody than I looked when I was the age of 16, having no hair. I've carried on with that journey subconsciously through using photography, and now busy with other people and their message and their appearance and what I want to present to you as to who they really are, not who they seem to be. So it's a choice about judgment. So I'm just going to have a little bit of water. This is a bizarre part of the world. This is a part of the world called Chukotka, excuse me. I'd never heard of it before either. It's the far northeastern part of Russia. To illustrate how isolated it is, it's a 13-hour non-stop flight from Moscow. That's if you get there safely, unlike these people in this aircraft. It's extremely isolated. I don't think there's a more isolated part of the planet. And I had this wild idea. I wanted to go to Chukotka to photograph the Chukchis. And the Chukchis are, from what I could gather, some of the world's last sort of authentic Eskimos living out in the tundra. And there's only about 80 or 90 left of them in 2 brigades. And I'd been to this part of the world previously a few years ago, although not to the Chukchis, made contact with somebody, kept in touch with them online. And one day I said, I'm coming with you to find the Chukchis. So I arrived and I said, right, okay, I'm ready, I'm off, ready for my journey. And the Chukchi guide said to me, he said, well, it's not quite as straightforward as that. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I don't really know where the Chukchis are. I said, what? You've persuaded me to come halfway across the world, and you're telling me that, I can't photograph the Chukchis when I want. I have a schedule. I've got this project. I have this plan I'm making. He said, well, you're going to have to trust me. He said, well, I'm not quite sure when we'll find them, but we may just find them. But you'll need to do a couple of things first. 1, you'll need to trust me. 2, we need to rent this tank. And 3, we're going to have to follow the reindeer droppings of the reindeer. And I said, what? You're going to take me in this tank indefinitely into the tundra. This is again in winter. It's extremely cold. And we're going to follow the reindeer droppings to find these Chukchis. He said, yeah, that's the only way it's ever going to happen. So you make this fantastic choice. You're in the middle of nowhere, and nothing is guaranteed. It actually it was quite expensive because it was a Russian military tank. And you indefinitely get into a box, essentially the size of a coffin. It doesn't travel faster than 10 kilometers an hour. The outside temperature is about minus 30, 40. Inside is minus 20. This is my cameraman, Bram, who traveled with me early in the morning. So the outside comes in. When it drives, you can't hear yourself thinking because it's like being in the dentist, the grinding of the thing. And this we sat in for 1 month. 1 month, day and night through the tundra. Always looking at the Chukchi guide, who often sat on the roof of the car, on the roof of the tank, and he would sort of put his hands up like this, and every day he would put his hands up like this. And after a month, you really lose all sense of bearings, all sense of directions. What on earth am I doing here? Until one day, a month later, we came over this hill, and there in the distance were these yurangas, these tents made out of the skin of reindeer. And it was like arriving in Shangri-La, and I know it doesn't look very impressive on this photograph, but if you spent a month sitting in a sardine tin, feeling like you've been at the dentist, drinking vodka and having tin meat, this is a very special experience, because in this tent are the Chukchi I've dreamed of finding and photographing. And we arrived, we jumped out, and I ran up to the chief Chukchi and said, hi, my name's Jimmy, I'm here to photograph. And he went, stop. And we had a very, very good translator with us. And he said, what do you mean stop? I've been waiting a month to come and take pictures of you. Here's my camera. And he said, no. You're going to listen to me now very, very, very clearly. If you don't do exactly what I say, you'll probably die today, because this is the harshest part of the world. So we're not taking any pictures, we're not doing anything. You're going to become part of our community now, and this is your job. So within seconds, there was no form of introduction. We became part of the community to survive. Eventually, over a period of time, we were there a number of weeks. We started chatting. They started opening up. As I said, in this case, unusually, I had a very, very good translator. And we started getting on with them. And I said, what on earth are you doing here? You're obviously quite intelligent people. You are on the edge of the world. It's never not snow and ice here. It's never above 0 degrees centigrade. What on earth are you doing living here? And they said, well, in actual fact, we've chosen to be here. I said, you've chosen to be here? How can you do that? He said, well, a number of years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, the Russian government said, well, you're all far too primitive. The way you live is not needed anymore. We're going to pack you up and move you to the nearest town. Well, the nearest town was about 3 weeks away. And we're going to give you a nice apartment with a telly and some schools for the kids and some old age people's home for the old people and endlessly flowing vodka. And you're going to be happily ever after. So off they went, they moved to the city, and in a very short period of time, things started changing. Now, I don't believe, and like a lot of the people I photograph, the term happiness is something that comes into their daily conversation. I believe very much it's something we've adapted in the modern world, into modern society. And in our case, it also still remains very, very vague. What is happiness? But they essentially said they started to become very, very unhappy. I said, well, how could you see that? And he said, well, our whole community disintegrated. We stopped communicating with one another. We stopped seeing our children. We stopped seeing the old people. We stopped being fulfilled, although they never used the term happy, because we had nothing to do. So in a very short period of time, that chief who I just showed you said, you know what, we're going to go back. So he packed up, there were about 40 of them. He said, we're all going back up to the tundra. And within a few days, they migrated back to the existence they have today. And the discussion was that they'd made a choice, because they live such a raw existence, they are so isolated, they are so extremely in touch with the nature that they live in, they have so little distraction other than the essence of being, that they decided that in the tundra, living in the Juranga, living with each other as a community, they had more purpose, they had more focus, they had more sense of being. And let's perhaps use the word happy. The children had a purpose. For example, we noticed the kids every evening, they would chew all the meat for the old people because the old people didn't have teeth. So they had a very, very profound purpose within the community. And vice versa, the old people were wise, they had a wisdom. And even when the old became infirm, and even to the extent when they died, numbers of them were mummified, because within society it's regarded that age is wisdom. So everybody has a very, very important role within this community. And at the end of it, every day is survival. Like the chief said to me when we got out of the car, out of the tank, we should have been a car, it was a tank. You know, you're going to have to work with us to survive today. Every day is survival, but at the end of every day, there's an enormous sense of fulfillment, an enormous sense of being, an enormous sense of sharing, an enormous sense of feeling where they are. So they'd made a choice to go back and start feeling, a choice to be in the now and to feel. And that also pushed me on a journey of self-reflection that, hey, Jimmy, I always have the choice. We often, as I mentioned at the beginning, we live an extremely comfortable existence here in the Western developed world. In my case, sometimes far too comfortable. We're very far removed from feeling. We're very far removed from being in touch with who we physically are and the nature. And these people, because they are in touch with it, in many ways, they have the privilege of knowing that and feeling that, made that choice. So that reminded me, Jimmy, you always have the choice. Although no matter how far removed you are from actually technically feeling it, you can choose, you are in control. This last story, anecdote, without being too evangelical, for me is very, very special. It's special for so many reasons. As photographers, this is probably, if you enjoy the nature and the outdoors, this is probably some of the most beautiful landscape in the world. And if you ever have the opportunity to go there, it's a must. It's the Altai Mountains in far northwestern Mongolia. And it's this extremely beautiful, never-ending landscape of dark mountains and rivers. And living in that landscape are the Kazakhs. Now, the Kazakhs are technically a nation of millions of people, but these particular Kazakhs live in Mongolia, on the other side of the border, and they're the Kazakh eagle hunters. And this is the way they look. This is the way they dress on a daily basis. And they're these sort of Hollywood characters. They're handsome, they're strong, they're physically, they're powerful. And they have this tradition with these eagles. They get given these eagles when they're pubers, when they're teenagers, and they spend the whole of their life living with this eagle. And they hunt with the eagle. And the eagle hunts for foxes and rabbits. And they have a sort of symbiosis between man and animal. So gloriously beautiful people to photograph and to be with. Very, very warm. And these unending vistas of these landscapes and these horses and this fur and these eagles. It's a fantastic feeling to be there. And after a while, I'd been looking around as I did for locations, and there was this one particular location that I wanted on top of a mountain with this view of the river and this sort of fantastic depth behind. And I decided to persuade them, guys, you have to come up with me every morning on top of this mountain, not every morning, on top of this mountain. I want to get the morning light. Now, as you can imagine, communication is always a bit strange. But persuading people who you don't speak a language with, in this case, we didn't have a good translator, to get up with you at 4 o'clock in the morning and climb up a mountain and stand on top and wait for the sunrise, it's a very strange experience. But if you're eccentric enough, if you're passionate enough, if you believe in what you want to do, you can find a way of communicating. So, but on this particular picture, this was the third morning. The first 2 mornings, there was no sunrise. So you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, you walk up on top of the mountain. It's a 3-hour walk. You're standing there, everybody's set up. First you shift all horses around because I want the white horse in the middle to give the eye, and the white horse is at the wrong side. So you're waving, you're screaming, and then you're ready, you stick up the tripod, put your camera, you've got 1 sheet of film, and then you look and you say, sorry, it's cancelled because the light's not getting up. And then these sort of Kazakhs very strangely look at you. But again, because there's been some kind of communication, they accept it and we walk down the mountain. We went up another morning, and then this was the third morning. Eventually we got there on the third morning and it was going to happen. It was extremely exciting. It's taken me years to get to this place, weeks to travel to this place, and this is the third morning to stand on top of this mountain to make this picture. And again, it's not so much the picture, it's this whole focus, it's this whole passion to make something that for me incorporates how beautiful these people are and the landscape that they sit in. So there you are, you're waiting, you know how it is, the light's rising, the wind's blowing, it's really cold, it's about -20. You've got very slow shutters on the film because I'm using 50 ISO film, probably half a second shutter speed because I want to get the depth in the landscape. And you're saying to the eagles and the horses and the guys, stay still, stay still. And again, I took my gloves off and I was getting all excited, just about to take the picture. And I went for the camera and my fingers stuck to the lens, because not the lens, the plate holding the lens. I thought, oh shit, here I am. I've come all this way. And typically me, over-enthusiastic, I'm not thinking. And this time I wasn't even drunk. Standing there and looking, oh no, I'm stuck. And these Kazakhs sort of standing there waiting, looking for me. And then I pulled my fingers off. I subsequently left all the skin behind on the lens, on the plate, looked at my fingers and, oh, Jesus. And then they started to bleed, and then they started to freeze. And in the freezing, it started to hurt. And I subsequently started to cry. I cried out of pain, but I also cried out of utter desperation. As you've just heard, I was excited to be here. This was the picture that I wanted to make, and I couldn't make it. I was incapable of functioning. Why the hell hadn't I bothered to take a simple digital camera with me? It would have been 10 times easier. No, I've taken this stupid old plate camera, and there I am sobbing, and I sit down, and I start crying and waving my fingers. And I didn't know, but not this lady, but 2 other ladies that followed us up the mountain. They were curious after the third day. What on earth are they doing every morning, getting up, walking on top of the mountain? And these 2 women came up to me, these bears of women, these big women, these big coats on. They waddled up to me, and one of them opened a jacket and gestured me over. And I was, oh, my finger. And she grabbed my hands and put them on her breast, not directly on her breast, but sort of in her oxals. And I was sort of, and then the other woman came up behind me, opened a jacket, and she enveloped herself around me, and they started rocking me and cuddling me like a child. My legs collapsed, and I started sobbing. I was exhausted, and I was in pain, and I was sad, because I couldn't make this picture. And this went on for 2 or 3 minutes, and they started humming strange tunes into my ears. But eventually, after 3 or 4 minutes, and lots of bleeding, my fingers found some form of feeling again. And before I knew it, very rudely for me, I pushed these women away, I staggered over to my camera, and there, still waiting, were these Kazakhs, still standing with their eagles in the wind's blowing, still thinking, what on earth is going on here? But we're sort of going to see the whole process through. I went to the camera, and I made 1 picture, and this was the only picture. And in many ways, you can't see it. This picture is far from perfect. The lens was shifted because I'd knocked the camera, half the picture's out of focus. It's the wrong exposure, etc. But there's so much passion, there's so much pain that went into making this picture. It has some kind of soul. For me, anyway. And then the picture be made, and then we wandered down the mountain, and then halfway down the mountain, I started to think, oh my God, something very, very wild has just happened. This is an Islamic culture. Now, they're not fundamentalists, they're not extremely strict, but it is an Islamic culture. And as we know, Islam is a fantastic culture, and they have very, very, very strict traditions and rituals. And one of those is that as a strange Western person, you don't touch their women. But not only had I touched the women, they had been indirectly given to me to protect me, to look after me. And I think the moral of the story being that by bearing your soul, by essentially becoming naked, by losing it, completely and utterly losing it, by stepping, we have an expression in English called touching the void, by looking over the edge and essentially falling, putting myself on this mountain with a stupid old camera, I showed who I was. I showed my fallibility, my vulnerability, but my passion. And through that passion and through that eccentricity, these human beings from another world, from another culture, who I couldn't verbally communicate with, broke all their traditions to help me make a picture. Now remember, I didn't pay them for this picture, and they haven't seen this picture, so indirectly they gained absolutely nothing from this experience, other than a form of human beings interrelating and connecting. And prior to having made that picture, as with all the pictures I make, I spend an enormous amount of time communicating and touching and being with the people, and trying and hopefully succeeding to make them feel important, make them feel special, put them on a pedestal. And as photographers, as you all are, you know how extremely important it is if you're photographing human beings. It's about the communication. It's not about the camera. It's not about the lens. It's not about the light. It's about how you feel about the person you're photographing. And if you dare really show the person how you feel, and you show them that they're special, the chances are you'll transcend onto another layer. So you have those three sort of anecdotes. They're a little bit evangelical, so I apologize, but they mean a lot to me. And where's that taking me? Well, the pictures have been made. I made a book a few months ago, last October. It's been published. It's called Before They Pass Away. Now, the title is very dramatic. Nobody's going to die. Maybe I will, but I don't think they will. But it's something is going to pass away. Their culture is going to pass away. And why do I think that's important? I think that's important because of a number of the lessons I've just shown you. It's not just how they look, it's who they are, it's what they represent. Now, the world, through the digitalization, is changing. It's always changed, but is it changing extremely quickly at the moment in a way that we were never further than 2 days away from the internet. Cultures have always evolved. They've always changed, but at the very moment in time, it's changing like wildfire because they will see the rest of the world, and in that, the homogenization of the world will happen before we know it. I think if that does happen, we will lose something very, very, very important. We will lose our origins. We will lose lessons which we still have to learn. We've developed in a fantastic way in the West, but I really believe we've lost an essence of, in some cases, of who we are. These people still have that. In my opinion, they're unaware that they have it. They're in touch with their physicality. They're in touch with themselves. They're in touch with the environment that they live in. They live a very, very pure existence. Now, I'm very romantic, and I'm not going to apologize for it. And I know it's an idealistic way of presenting it. And there are many areas of gray in between. But these people have to be documented. But they don't necessarily have to be preserved. It would be very arrogant of me or of us to say, you have to stay there on top of the mountain, sitting on your horse, waiting for somebody else to come and take a picture. They are allowed to develop and evolve. But what they should be told and taught from us is that you already have an affluence that we don't have anymore, and vice versa. We have something fantastic which you don't have. So we need to form a debate. We need to form a discussion. We need to learn from each other. So what I'm going to try and do in the next few years, and I'm in contact with a number of television stations and sponsors, is to return to all these tribes and start a discussion with them, with the book, perhaps with some anthropologists, with some slightly more academically intelligent people than I am. I'll purely be the person with the ants on my pants, the catalyst for the process. Present them with the book and say, is this who you see yourself? Are you aware of what you are? Are you aware of how we see you? And vice versa, what do we have to teach you? And that's the sort of the introduction of the project I'm doing. I have a few more minutes. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? And thank you very much for bearing with my English and my sort of a rather eccentric way of presenting. Nobody else wants to ask anything? Well, there's one nice anecdote in, yeah, somebody over there? Excuse me? The question was, do I only use available light? Okay, the technical, it's all available light. The landscapes are always made in the morning and the evening, as you can see. All the portraits are made during the middle of the day. They're all made inside. So, for example, can you come up here a second? I'll illustrate something. So if you imagine you're sitting here, imagine you're sitting where you just stand. The majority of the time, you have to make sure you're very, very low. So I'm always lower than you. So when you come in and make the portraits, invariably it's inside, in a tent or in a house. I have about 3 or 4 reflectors with me. One of the big reflectors is outside, and you give that to the villagers, so they're shining in the daylight from outside. Then in and around you, inside, there are 2 or 3 other small reflectors, so we're bouncing the light, which is much the same as in a studio, but you end up having very, very slow light, so with shutter speeds of sometimes 3 or 4 seconds. But what's very special about that is it's very, very slow and it's very, very intimate. So I have to communicate with you as the sitter. Firstly, you don't understand what I'm doing. Secondly, you see the strange person on their knees, very low. And it's all about, you have to be extremely still. So as you can imagine, with a shutter speed of 3 or 4 seconds, we have to have learned to communicate. You have to completely understand what I'm doing. So you begin by touching. So you begin by going, wow, and if it's a guy, you're, whoa, or if it's a woman, you're, oh, and then you wait with the face and you're moving the face as you often do in a studio. But because it's so slow, because it's so intimate, there's this sort of communication. And because there's no digital camera involved, I'm not looking in the back of the screen, I'm not sitting on a computer. I spend the whole time looking at the person in the face. And the camera is set up, and it's all about waiting for the light and then seeing their mannerisms, seeing the way their eyes close and shut. As you saw in some of the pictures, there are animals. So there's a potential awful lot of movement which you've got to control. And sometimes it takes hours and hours and hours to get into that focus with one another. And then if you're traveling to the other side of the world for 2 months, you don't have boxes and sheets of film with you. You're very, very limited. So I try from each picture to only make 1 picture. So it's a real sort of a hypnotherapy between me and the sitter. And then also what's funny, you often arrive in parts of Africa, you arrive in the village, and they're quite intimidating, and they're running around, and they're pushing me, and they've got guns. And you become very small, you become like a dog, and then eventually you find in the group, there's one person who's curious, what's in your little box, and you start this relationship with them, and eventually you start taking his picture, and before you know it, somebody else will come in and push you away, and then they'll want to sit on the chair as well, because they want me to touch them, they want to feel strong, they want me to compliment them. And then as the days go on, the whole new village arrives from another mountain. There's 30 people standing outside, all wanting to sit in that chair. It's all about vanity. It's all about vanity, which is brought on between slowing the process down, using available light, and developing a relationship. Does anybody else have any more questions? Yes? One. Cameraman, Bram, who's filming the whole process. So he stands behind me with a Canon, and he films the whole thing, and he's making a making of. And what we're trying to do is combine that with me returning and going to new tribes, and then we'll be making a television series out of it. But more often than not, with respect to him, he's my shadow. So it's all about me. So the smaller the group, the more it is about, and as we were discussing a few minutes ago, by having the more difficult it is to communicate, the more isolated, the less interpreters, the better it is, because you're forced yourself to find a way of contacting. Excuse me? Yeah, you often have guides, but for example, you have translators, but if you go to somewhere like Papua New Guinea, in the world, there are 7,000 official languages. Of each 7,000 languages, there are thousands of dialects. So you arrive in the town, and he says, I'm your guide, and you pay me. So you take him, and then you arrive in the valley many weeks later, and he said, come on, communicate. And he goes, yeah, I don't know this dialect. And it's often the case. So you're always stuck. So the more remote you become, the more isolated you become, you yourself are forced to communicate. But the beauty is that it's all possible. If you really believe in what you're doing, and if you really love the people and the subject, it's possible to communicate with them. And then there is guides, but half the time they can't go, they do go. A lot of it is I don't believe in luck, a lot of it is belief. It's, for example, we were in a beautiful story in the Pacific in a group of islands. I don't know where any of you have been there, called Vanuatu, 83 islands. It's about a 4-hour flight from Sydney. And you can fly to the main island, but outside that there are many other islands, and 4 of the islands I wanted to get to. And I knew some fantastic, this image was made there, some fantastic tribes lived on those islands, but the only way to get there is by boat. And that takes months and months and months, and as you can imagine, I don't have months. So I went to the local airport, and I saw on the end of the runway a little small yellow Cessna, 4-seater yellow plane, and I found the owner, and I said to him, can you take me to these islands? And he says, no, there's no runway there. So I said, door closed. And then via, I found his nephew, who was 23 and a pilot. And I showed him lots of money and said, would you like an adventure with me? And he goes, well, what kind of adventure are you looking for? And I said, well, I want to get to these 3 islands. And he says, yeah, but there's no runway there. And I said, oh, we'll be fine, we'll be fine. We just let the air out of the wheels, and there's beaches everywhere. We'll be fine. We'll buy an inflatable boat, we'll throw it in the back, and off we go. And he eventually came with me, and we ended up putting enough petrol to fly there and back. So if we couldn't land, we could turn around and fly back to the island. And by trusting, by letting go, by daring to fulfill your dream, we ended up getting to all these places via aircraft and landing on these beaches, and then ending up photographing pictures like this, of these fantastic sort of atolls with these tribes. And so, yeah, it's sort of an element of belief and trust that you're capable. And I think as I illustrated earlier in the talk, by traveling from early childhood, I have an inner built belief that I can find a way to communicate, even if I don't have the language. Because I really believe and love what I'm doing. And it's not per se, like I started the conversation, about photography, but it's about the story I'm trying to tell. And I'm going to conclude, and this sounds a bit sort of, again, evangelical, but I find very, very important. A number of people come up to me and they say, Jimmy, we'd love to be a photographer too. I said, first of all, it's very easy. You can go and buy a camera. But secondly, what do you want to say with the pictures? And everything goes blank. Well, I don't know. So do I have to say anything? And I said, well, until you find what your story is, find why you want to make those pictures, you'll never become a photographer. You'll never be able to make a living at photography, in my opinion. Because until you really feel what the message is, it's not about the photography, it's about what you are as a person and what you're trying to communicate. And if you're obsessed by beautiful naked women, that's fantastic too. That has to be your obsession. And in your obsession, you will make the most beautiful pictures that have ever been made. Because it's the story, it's not the technique. And all the camera I use has no value. You can buy it online for absolutely nothing. But it's the story I'm very, very passionate about. Okay. I think I've finished. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.